Hello, I'm Dr. Fergus Cameron, and this is the history of diabetes camps in Victoria. Every day, as many as 9 Australians will develop type 1 diabetes. Around half of those will be children and adolescents. Type 1 diabetes is one of the most common life-threatening diseases of childhood. The story of diabetes camps in Victoria is a story of change. Changes in philosophy, changes in medical therapy, and changes in how things are run. Before 1921, type 1 diabetes was a fatal disease. That all changed when 2 researchers by the names of Banting and Best made a discovery so miraculous that it resulted in the fastest Nobel Prize for Medicine being awarded ever. That discovery was insulin. And so when insulin arrived in Australia in 1923, the doctors at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne began successfully treating children with diabetes. But they quickly learnt that there was much more to managing the condition than just giving insulin.
Even after insulin development, there was no clinic, and the children on insulin were looked after by just general doctors around. When I first went there, it was very, very focused on teaching them and making sure their health was good.
Treatment tools were fairly simple, with an emphasis on controlling blood glucose levels by balancing diet and exercise, together with the regimen of painful daily insulin injections. It meant that the day-to-day burden came at a physical and emotional cost to families and patients alike. And while the physical outcomes gradually improved with each decade, the emotional burden continued to be a significant problem in kids with diabetes, even today. It took a doctor with type 1 diabetes herself, the first diabetes doctor at the Royal Children's Hospital in fact, to recognise this. Dr. Geraldine Amies could see an urgent need for out-of-hospital support for children and their families.
She had some very strong ideas, which were in those days very positive and unusual.
She needed an intervention that would serve as an opportunity to improve the physical and emotional health of her patients with diabetes. In 1946, just 25 years after the discovery of insulin, life for children with diabetes took an adventurous turn. The well-known Joslin Centre in Boston had their first camp in 1927 for boys and in 1932 for girls. Elliot Joslin was the first doctor in America to specialise in diabetes care in children. He developed a 3-horse motif to reflect his philosophy. He strongly believed insulin, exercise and diet would achieve victory over diabetes. The first Royal Children's Hospital camp in 1946 was novel and at the leading edge of diabetes care at the time. And behind that change was Geraldine Amies. Born in Holland but raised in Scotland, Dr. Amies was the first physician in charge of the RCH Diabetes Clinic and was appointed in 1946. She was described as a formidable figure who retained her Scottish accent and certainty. Dr. Amies saw that running a camp for children with diabetes over summer could provide them with a holiday, could provide their parents with a break, and with good diet and exercise, allow for their health to be improved under the watchful eyes of the staff from the hospital. She well understood Dr. Joslin's 3-horse chariot model of good diabetes care. And so, holiday camps for children with diabetes at the Royal Children's Hospital became a reality. Dr. Amies led a pioneering group of 7 medical, nursing and dietetic staff from the Royal Children's Hospital. These intrepid figures had very little way of knowing what to expect. Nobody had ever run diabetes camps in Australia before, and the clinical tools at their disposal were very simple. Their endeavour and ambition was remarkable. The first camp was held over Christmas 1946 for 3 weeks. The location was the Royal Children's Hospital Orthopaedic Hospital Annex at Mount Eliza, a coastal village near Melbourne. As Dr. Amies dryly noted at the time, it was close enough to town for visitors, yet far enough away from tuck shops for venturesome children. The first camp was supported by the Committee of Management of the hospital and free for the children who attended.
Technically, inpatients didn't cost them anything, and they were using hospital facilities.
The hospital also provided 2 part-time medical officers, 1 senior nurse, known as the camp mother, 3 dietetic staff and 1 recreational officer. There was also a 16-year-old ex-Royal Children's Hospital patient who acted as a volunteer leader. 24 children aged between 6 and 14 years attended the very first camp. Since then, diabetes camps have been held all over Victoria at 14 different locations, up in the mountains, down by the sea and everywhere in between. Camps have been in purpose-built camping facilities, schools, under canvas in the bush and in the sand dunes of the Victorian coast. Dr. Amy's uncompromising spirit, some might say disciplinarian at times, meant that she was as demanding of the kids as she was of herself. It epitomised a dedication that would see Dr. Amy's provide care for children and diabetes at the Royal Children's Hospital for 20 years.
She believed in very strong, firm control of diabetes, largely through diet and urine testing.
Any perceived social experience that children gained while on camp was secondary to getting kids fit, as well as trying to teach them a bit about their diabetes.
A school teacher had them all doing sport in a proper way. We reached a point where we were teaching them all to swim. They all had the Herald Swim certificate.
They were taught to give themselves injections. In those early days, the injections were with glass syringes. They involved large volumes of murky-looking insulin and were administered using metal needles. By today's standards of 35G needles, these things were like house nails. They were readily cleaned, sterilised and reused, and when the needles got blunt, they were sharpened with a whetstone. There was a great focus on meals too, with the early dietitians, Sheila Sutherland and Mavis Honey, following a strict formula.
And at lunchtime, every child lined up. Each child was given their own meal weighed out for that child and had to sit down and would not leave the table until they'd ate it.
Food still plays an enormous role in camps these days, but perhaps a little less so than in the early life of camps. For the children, this was an all-encompassing experience. Children had to do chores, and since they were at camp for so long, they actually grew their own food. This was an old school camp, and in those days, and right up until the 1970s, there was no diabetes education on the wards of the hospital.
A nurse educator was a very late development and came only because of long conversations and arguments I had with the director of nursing, because they took the view that nurses were there to save lives. They were there to maintain the health of the kids in the ward, and it was not their role to teach. And that was why a dietitian, Sheila Sutherland, took a major role, recognising the fact that if they didn't eat all their dinner, well, they'd be at risk of having a hypoglycemic attack.
It made the camps one of the very few opportunities where education could be undertaken, and the camps were treated very much as a tune-up, getting kids ready to transition to adult care then at the age of 15. Part of this process was ensuring that they were all immunised against tuberculosis. Geraldine's husband, Arthur Amys, was the Dean of Dentistry at the University of Melbourne. He, and subsequently Dr. Roger Hall, saw the camps as a means to provide dental health care as well. Each camp was visited by a dental van, and all children underwent dental checks and treatments. In those days, there was no way of measuring blood glucose outside of the laboratory. All that was available was the testing of glucose levels in urine. This was neither timely nor particularly accurate. It only gave clinicians a very, very rough idea about what the children's blood glucose levels had been a few hours prior to their urine tests. One of the much feared complications of type 1 diabetes was poor circulation leading to limb amputation. The cause of this at the time was not known, but not surprisingly, a lot of emphasis was placed upon foot hygiene and exercise. Low blood glucose levels, or hypoglycemia, was dealt with in inventive ways. The camp mother always had a special kit called the trouble case. In that case was an orange, glucose tablets and adrenaline. Glucagon had not yet been invented. Given that the range of therapeutic options was largely orange juice, adrenaline, it was no wonder that the trouble case achieved notoriety amongst the campers. The camps always had a certain amount of profile with visitors too, so it was no surprise that an American Davis Cup player, Ham Richardson, who also had diabetes, visited the Royal Children's Hospital camp in 1953 and put on a dazzling tennis clinic.
There comes a time when children themselves want to learn about diabetes so they can look after themselves.
The 60s heralded a change in focus. The medical tune-up aspect was emphasised less. Learning about self-reliance in a fun environment became the primary goal. Enter John Court, a paediatrician from the Royal Children's Hospital. Geraldine Amies was not always well, and she was only able to attend the hospital on clinic days, so Dr. Court would do all the after-hours cover for diabetes. As a result, Dr. Court took over the running of the camps.
Diabetes led the way by changing the age of leaving the hospital to 18. That was just for diabetics. I told the committee of management that I'd been working in the diabetic clinic at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and that was no place for a 14-year-old child with diabetes. And I said, I'm not sending him any there, they've got to stay here till 18. And they said, all right, well, the diabetics can.
John Court's involvement and expertise of diabetes camps became internationally recognised. He even took groups to Japan to advise the Japanese how camps should be run.
When we got there, I said to the teenagers, by the way, you've come for the camp for fun, but you're actually going to do the teaching, not me. I said, we're going to talk about how you look after yourself during the day. Staff from a number of Asian countries came to me afterwards and said, how would I feel if they used the same way of teaching? I said, that's good.
Diabetic camps are good fun, and there are plenty of things to do. Several camp leaders have diabetes themselves, and by their example, show that diabetic care can be a natural part of their life. Finding other people with the same problems is reassuring to the boys, and being part of the group helps them to accept diabetes.
Right from the very first camp, ex-patients and campers have been leaders on diabetes camps. This became formalised under Dr. Court, with structured training and position descriptions.
Such a good place to confide in people and share their worries and find solutions to problems that they had.
It was to build up a very positive feeling about having diabetes. Older diabetics would set a good example, so the younger ones could look up and say, hey, he can do it or she can do it, so can I. We learnt both nationally and internationally to listen to kids.
Camps started to be more age-banded. There were separate junior and senior camps. At that stage, camps being quite medical, hospital benefits could be claimed, and that subsidised the camps. However, as the number of campers increased and demand grew, so did the costs and other complexities. The campers started to pay for camp, but this wasn't always sufficient. So fundraising started to play a big role in increasing revenue to ease the burden of growing costs.
I think we had trouble with people affording to pay the later camps when fees had to be charged, and eventually we developed a trust.
At the same time, Diabetes Victoria started to run a separate camping program in 1954. They had their own diabetes camp champion, Gwen Scott. Gwen was the first diabetes nurse educator in Victoria and Diabetes Victoria's first employee. Gwen's area of interest was in diabetes management and in the development and support of health professionals working with children with diabetes. She developed camp programs for families and was a strong advocate for all people with diabetes. Later, she became Diabetes Australia's first chief executive.
She always had a passion about camps, and it's like, wow, made a difference. It really did.
Imagine a career spanning 37 years. Gwen's focus was unwavering. Not only was she dedicated to the well-being of people with diabetes, but she actively sought to improve the skills of health professionals who looked after them. Just as Geraldine Amies and John Court pioneered diabetes camps for RCH, so did Gwen Scott for Diabetes Victoria. Throughout this period, tools of diabetes care remained rudimentary: reusable glass syringes and complicated urine testing for glucose. However, the technology was improving. First came urine dipstick testing and then disposable plastic syringes and needles. A welcome change, no doubt. But it was in 1978, the advent of portable blood glucose testing devices, was when the real revolutionary change occurred. This was the breakthrough that families and clinicians were waiting for.
The camps really changed once we had blood testing machines.
For them to live on without complications, they had to have good control. And that became easier as time went on because we had blood testing to monitor it rather than urine testing, which was a very poor way of doing so.
This in turn allowed for a greater flexibility in lifestyle and less pressure upon families. Diabetes camps were increasingly seen as part of standard diabetes care. Changes in the tools of diabetes care did not occur in a vacuum. The age of modernity descended upon diabetes camps. Long hair, flared jeans, colour film, and the first sugar-free soft drinks appeared on the scene. By the 1990s, diabetes camps were considered mainstream. They were being run all over the world by most tertiary paediatric diabetes care centres. After a landmark study in 1993, there was a greater push to improve blood glucose control during childhood. This was in order to avoid diabetes-related complications later in life.
How come other kids are allowed to have lollies and I aren't?
Well, lollies have got a lot of sugar in them, haven't they?
And where better to learn about diabetes than at camp with other children who also have diabetes?
Coupled with all of these changes was the ever-increasing awareness of the psychological burden associated living with the condition.
What did you do, have a brain transplant or something?
No, I've got diabetes.
What's that? Too much sugar or something?
No, it's when your pancreas stops working. What's your pancreas?
The importance of creating a space where kids with diabetes could feel normal was recognised. Similarly, the importance of peer support and peer-to-peer learning was also becoming apparent. The benefits of a brief period of camps seemed to be sustained for months and even years.
I've come on camp because my mum thought it would be a great experience, so when I go over to friends' houses, she won't have to come and follow me around everywhere I go.
It's probably helped me to be a bit more independent with injections.
You learn lots of stuff at camp, so it really helps out with learning new injection sites and learning more kinds of foods you can eat.
We had heard that one of the aims of the camp is to teach kids to self-inject. If they do it in that sort of environment, then myself or her mother trying to do it at home. And it worked. She's self-injected, so we're very happy.
The leaders have taught me not to be scared of trying new things.
I want to learn more about how I need to look after myself.
When I was a camper, the main thing I gained was diabetic friends.
Leading up to the 2000s, the Royal Children's Hospital was running 3 camps: junior, senior and teenage, mostly supported by the hospital. The funding predominantly came through campus subscriptions and funds generated by clinical consultations at the beginning and end of each camp. Serendipitously, the Alice Curry Trust had been established just for camps through the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation. There was also a fundraising auction held in December prior to camps, and right at the heart of it was the inimitable Barry Novi. Barry had been involved with camps when he was in Denver in the US and needed no convincing.
The camp could use some money, and indeed, as I recall, they didn't have the funding for a camp nurse. So consequently, we created a fundraising program, an auction of unusual goods.
We had philanthropic support for the camps probably going back to the late 80s.
Most of the people, obviously, who came to the auctions loved camp. If they didn't, they wouldn't be coming usually and coming back with their friends.
People raised money through various activities and went into that fund.
Because a lot of people also like being at the Royal Children's Hospital or being able to assist.
And eventually we came up with the idea of Medicare funding. I think that must have been probably in the 90s.
The strain on human resources, equipment, training updates, indemnity insurance and public liability were real concerns stepping into the 21st century. Diabetes Victoria was facing similar issues with their camps. Changes in procedure and technology were adding unforeseen complexity to both camping programs.
We spent a lot of time really, tightening up a lot of the structures and really looking at, what are the risks involved in this and what are we doing that perhaps needs to change to make sure that everybody is being kept incredibly safe. So not only the students, but also the volunteers and the healthcare professionals who are involved as well.
Over the next few years, the diabetes service at Monash also grew quite a lot. So the actual numbers in the clinic were growing, so it was becoming more difficult for children to access the camps.
On the back of this, awareness was growing around the particular needs of children from rural areas and the challenges they were facing. The camps had to reach these children, who routinely were more isolated and less likely to experience peer support than their metropolitan counterparts.
DAV was servicing kids from regional rural areas who didn't necessarily have an affiliation with the children's. We felt that there was a pretty big demand for that older adolescent, young and middle adolescent group to actually access camps. One of the challenges was you wanted to be able to prioritise kids who'd never been to a camp before, kids who came from those regional areas.
Royal Children's Hospital and Diabetes Victoria ran separate camping programs, with Melbourne's other paediatric hospital, Monash Children's, supporting the Diabetes Victoria camps, two organisations doing the same great work for the same demographic. After taking over the role from George Werther as Head of Diabetes at the Royal Children's Hospital, I was well aware of the challenges facing our camp program and, to a lesser extent, the challenges Diabetes Victoria were facing. The indemnity crisis of the early 2000s brought things to a head. I decided to make a phone call to see if the Royal Children's Hospital, Monash Children's Health and Diabetes Victoria could join forces.
My husband always spoke about strategic alliances, working together for the greater good. So you had phoned me, Dr. Cameron, and I went, yes, we're going to do this.
So that was really when we started to think, well, is there some merit here in trying to pool our resources, maybe expand the number of camps, but give all the children, both RCH, Monash and those country kids, a sort of similar opportunity to actually access the camps.
The Diabetes Camps Consortium consists of 3 organisations. It was established around 2001, 2002. The 2 main paediatric centres are Royal Children's Hospital, Monash Children's Hospital and of course Diabetes Victoria.
This was the birth of Diabetes Camps Victoria, and given the complexities, it had to be a process of gradual change. 2 very different camping cultures had to morph, and new procedures had to be developed and followed. There was a gradual merging over a period of around 4 years.
Of course, it was about setting up formal agreements between Children's, Monash, DAV. There were a number of procedures and guidelines that we put in place, both around the staffing, supporting the staffing, the insurance requirements, the occupational health and safety requirements. Then there came the issue that there were more and more kids who were actually on pumps, So we had to sort of expand those guidelines as to how we were going to actually manage those.
Diabetes Camps Victoria, as it is now called, through the merger, allowed for a more robust infrastructure underpinning the camp program.
Getting there was a bit of a worry, but then the check-in process, which is so thorough, I was, felt very at ease. They're very good there.
It is amazing though how quickly at drop-off they see the setup, and straight away all their concerns are pretty much, I guess, calmed.
Perhaps most importantly, the funding base was able to be broadened with contributions from campus subscriptions, clinical consultation funding, Diabetes Victoria and the Alice Curry Trust.
We started to have more professional staff involved. We didn't just have the 1 or 2 nurses and a dietitian. It just be increased in size. So it was a more matter of magnitude and perhaps a bit more professional organisation.
Bye. Okay.
All right. Have a great time. Enjoy. Effectively, the formation of the consortium meant that now all the parties were working together as Diabetes Camps Victoria. One thing that did not change was the model of learning through having fun. Camps were now becoming more and more adventurous. Morris dancing had given way to disco. Calisthenics had given way to giant swings, surfing and swimming with the dolphins. Most of the camp leaders are ex-campers themselves and have diabetes. We have always actively recruited leaders from past campers. Apart from happy memories, past campers seem to relish the opportunity to give back and act as role models for the next generation of campers.
Most kids only go halfway up, right? And they go, oh, and then they come back down. They look up and go, you know what? I was halfway and I could have kept going.
If you make it down now, once I come down, I'll high-five you. I shall high-five you. If you don't make it past, it's okay.
Remember, use your vertical ones. Yeah, that's it. Good.
Keep going, Mac. You're doing good.
That's it, Ash. You can do it.
So the easiest part is that wooden part there. Believe me, it is.
Yay!
Halfway to the top. See?
Yeah, we both did.
Good on you, Shito. You did awesome.
That was scary. Do you want to take off your harness? Because we only got to go once.
But what of the families and parents? Camps are not just about the kids. The families themselves also seem to get a lot out of it.
Oh, it's great. It's just worry-free. It's, a few nights where you can sleep through, hopefully, and you don't have to worry that, everything, she's being looked after. She's got great care over there.
While the camp is actually on, it is respite for the parents. We hear parents say, it's the first time I've slept through the night since my child was diagnosed with diabetes. The real benefit, I think, for the parents is meeting other parents with diabetes, and that's their peer group.
There's a few mums, like since the last camp, we've had a catch up at the Botanical Gardens, so we've caught up there.
They also see their kids in a really different environment. They see them around other children with diabetes. They're not the only different kid, which is often what the case is when they're at school or in their playgroup or their kindergarten.
These days, there is a lot of talk about family-centred care, a lot about providing care for all children in Victoria. Sometimes these notions can be a little abstract, but if you want to see them in action, in concrete terms, that's what diabetes camps are all about. So we jump forward to where we are now. People living with type 1 diabetes with good metabolic control can expect to live a fairly normal lifespan. Diabetes technologies and medicine is advancing faster than ever. The repertoire of therapies that kids come on camp with is much broader than it used to be. So everyone, from the clinical staff to the camp leaders and even the children, are constantly upskilling to adapt to these changes.
What's changed with her is since she's been on the pump, when injections are very restrictive with what you eat, but the pump gives you a bit more flexibility, so that's been a change that we've discovered.
The evolution of camps has gone parallel with the evolution of the management of diabetes in general.
We're always having to try and keep abreast of all these changes, and that is a challenge in itself. So part of our responsibility is also making sure that we can adapt to that.
The camps are still an excellent place for nurses, dietitians and doctors to learn about diabetes in the real world and the benefits and limitations of new diabetes technologies. The camps continue to be an excellent training resource for tomorrow's specialists from Monash Health and the Royal Children's Hospital.
I have trouble recalling any staff member who came back and said that was awful. They always came back and said that was wonderful.
In a virtuous cycle, the camps themselves are able to run because these partner hospitals provide the specialist medical teams who provide support and guidance.
There are probably more diabetic children now than there were going back 30 years ago. And I think the camping would be more accepted rather than questionable in some families. Now it would be the usual thing, so I can understand very well that you would need more facilities.
As far as the selection of the campers goes, we try to make it as transparent and equitable as possible. For every child that actually does get offered a place at camp, there's usually one child who misses out.
The major issue on our watch now is mental health, and this is now the leading complication of type 1 diabetes during childhood. This is significant because going into your 20s with a mental health issue increases your risk of diabetes-related complications.
Before I went on diabetes camp, I only knew roughly about what happened during diabetes. But then they've got like diabetes educators there that if you don't know something, you can ask them a question and they'll answer it.
The metropolitan-based kids had some more positive scores on the psychosocial side than the regional kids. And so that actually sort of made us realise that some further peer support for the children and young people with diabetes in those regional areas could be a very positive thing to improve some of their psychosocial scores and interactions.
One of my friends I've made from this one is going to the one I'm going to this year as well.
Yeah, so
good.
They talk on FaceTime, is it?
Yeah.
Or, yeah, so they catch up.
I think camps primarily are about the support networks that these children develop whilst they're at camp, and these are the support networks which will help them throughout their lives.
I'm sold on camping because it gives children a chance to be themselves outside of the house, and it's particularly important for diabetic kids.
So once a child has a diabetes camp under their belt, I think that gives them a lot more confidence than when it comes time to attending a school camp.
She comes back more confident in being able to deal with it herself rather than relying on me a lot.
The small number of children who would arrive at the camp and be terribly homesick for the first 24, 48 hours. They would be desperate. Please call my mum, I want to go home. They'd be in tears. By the end of the week, these same kids never wanted to go home.
Responding proactively to the mental health demands of living with type 1 diabetes is key. So it's fair to say that diabetes camps have filled this niche, particularly to help kids feel normal about their diabetes, to introduce them to other people and establish peer networks. And so, diabetes camps is very much operated as a sort of surrogate mental health support. Children have a life and they have skills and qualities that are amazing outside their diabetes. Diabetes Camps Victoria is working harder than ever to help them manage their condition through positive experiences.